Today we turn to art that explores identity. Contemporary artists often use art as a way to explore the underlying power structures that shape our lives and our societies. That's what art historians and critics call critical theory. Now, two strands of critical theory that are especially important to art are feminism and race theory. I'm going to turn to feminism in a later lecture, although feminism will come up when we look at Faith Ringgold. Her work in particular raises the question of whether traditional female art, such as textile weaving or quilting, is inappropriately labeled craft rather than art, precisely because it's made by women. Race or ethnic theory focuses on the way that art reinforces existing patterns of race-based power and authority, and how it can be used to reinforce or to challenge racial and ethnic stereotypes. Sometimes, as we'll see, artists address stereotypes by thrusting them into our face. So, are you wondering what the terms kato and kavo mean? It's Russian, a language I actually studied in college and alas have mostly forgotten. In Russian, kato kavo basically means who, whom, or in this context, who, subject, and to whom, object. Lenin said that all politics could be summed up with those two words, kato kavo, or to be a little more crude, who's doing it to whom. Stay tuned for Kara Walker. So our required works include plenty of art that celebrates the katos, the folks on top. We see this in the Western tradition, and we see it in the non-Western tradition as well. We even have some works that celebrate, record, or mourn the experience of the kavos, the subjects and too often the victims of the katos. As I looked through our required works, I noted that most of these art, and later Western art at that, for most of art history and in most societies around the globe, the katos make the rules and commission the art. On to our required works. But let me just note that it's unfair to these works and to these artists to think of them solely in terms of explorations of racial and ethnic identity. I'm just looking for common themes, and that's one that seemed to make sense here. We've talked about this multimedia work before, and the points it makes aren't hard to figure out, so this is going to be a quick review. Let me just share a few things I learned when I did some further research. The artist's first name comes from the French word for yellow, Jean, from her French Cree ancestry. Her middle name, Quick to See, was given to her by her Shoshone grandmother as a sign of her ability to grasp things readily. She grew up on the Flathead Reservation in Montana and traveled around the Pacific Northwest and California with her father, who was a horse trader. Let's watch a quick video clip of the Smithsonian interview with the artist, which will also show you some of her other works. So here's another work by the same artist. Think attribution question. What elements does this work share with trade? Well, we see a combination of words and text, an underlayer of newspaper articles pasted on in a collage, and textual as well as visual references to Native American creation stories. Also, both works are painterly. That is, the brushstrokes in the painting technique is obvious. Far from disguising her media and her techniques, this artist highlights them. So, just a few questions to ponder and discuss if you have time. What is the meaning of the canoe? What are the multiple meanings of the dripping red paint? What is the subject, the topic of the stories that appear in the underlying newsprints? And finally, do you remember the term for this kind of mixed media work, which includes dangling objects? That one I'll answer. It's a combine, especially associated with the artist Robert Rauschenberg, who's dropped off the list, but it wouldn't surprise me to see this term drop back into the exam. Faith Ringgold is an African-American artist who uses a traditional female art form, the quilt, to tell narratives about African-American women's lives and to reinforce that women's crafts are in fact truly art. In the French collection, Faith Ringgold makes her alter ego Willa Marie Simone, a 16-year-old black girl who, quote, escaped from the cotton fields of Georgia and the side streets of Harlem, unquote, in the 1920s to live it up in Paris as an artist and model, as in fact some noted African-American women did. So here are some of the other works from the series. Let's listen to the artist herself describe these works. By the way, the rest of the video is up on Moodle, as is a New York Times review of the French collection, which I didn't assign but really enjoyed, and you might as well. So I trust that you all recognize the painting in the center, right above the jumping little girl. In fact, all three works are Leonardo da Vinci's, now hanging in the Louvre. Here's an AP question from the past about the Faith Ringgold work that appears in your textbook reading. How would you answer the question about the medium, that is, quilts? Well, our next artist takes stereotypes to a whole new level, more shocking and for some a lot more off-putting. Let's hear Kara Walker's own description of her artistic motivations and intentions. This is a trailer for a PBS show about her work. A longer segment is up on Moodle. Pay special attention to Kara Walker's unusual technique. Her works are black paper silhouettes cut out and hot glue gun to the walls. An overhead projector flashes colored lights and some images against the silhouettes. So what point do you think she's making by using this now rather old technology? Well, for many of her viewers, the overhead projector is still reminiscent of school lectures delivered before PowerPoints took over. That's my era. She's teaching history, right? The overhead projector lends a kind of authority to her work. What other purpose does the overhead projector serve? Well, when the viewer walks in front of the projector, you see that happening here, his or her silhouette joins the throng. In other words, the way the art is portrayed emphasizes that this is our history too, how we are portrayed or implicated in the story. Kara Walker deliberately evokes a form of media entertainment that was very popular in the late 19th century, just before the age of motion pictures, the cyclorama. Circular or hexagonal spaces were covered with paintings. Sometimes a diorama of statues was placed in the foreground to provide additional realism. This 1883 photograph shows an artist painting a diorama depicting the Battle of Gettysburg, and a portion of the painting appears below. The most popular cyclorama traveled from city to city to provide local entertainment, much like a modern movie. As the viewer stood in the center of the painting, there would often be music and a narrator who was telling the story of the event depicted. The silhouette was also a popular pre-photography art form. Basically, it offered a cheap but effective alternative to portrait miniature, and skilled specialist artists could cut a high-quality bust portrait, by far the most common style, in a matter of minutes just using their eye. Again, photographs would largely drive out this art form. So why do you think the artist uses 18th and 19th century art forms that have now pretty much disappeared? Why might that be important to her? And why silhouettes? Well, Kara Walker's own answer, we don't get this far in the video, is that a silhouette, quote, lends itself to the avoidance of the subject, not being able to look at it directly, unquote. But in fact, silhouettes do direct our look, often in disturbing ways, forcing us to confront our racial stereotypes. So, here's a question for you to look at your own. In these Kara Walker silhouettes, who is a black slave and who is a white master, and how can you tell? By the way, her representation of stereotypes, the pickaninny, the well-endowed black man, disturbed many of her fellow African-American artists. So here's a more recent work by the artist, a giant sculpture made of sugar, covered by figures of small boys covered with a resin intended to mimic molasses. Another sugar product, surrounded by. Does the subject and message remind you of another required work? How about Wilfredo Lamb's The Jungle, which also addresses the oppressive nature of the sugar production and trade? So here's an excerpt from an article entitled, Why I Yelled at the Kara Walker Exhibit. I've posted the whole article on Moodle. The artist describes visiting this exhibit. Here's a quote. I walked into the crowd, turned to face them, and began yelling. You are recreating the very racism this art is supposed to critique. The visitors lowered their cameras. Just seconds ago, they've been aiming their lenses at the sculpture of a 40-foot-tall, nude, black female sphinx. Many posed under its ass. Some laughed and pointed at its vulva. So here was an artwork about how black people's pain was transformed into money, and it was a tourist attraction. A few weeks ago, I had gone to the 9/11 Museum, and no one, absolutely no one, posed for smiling pictures in front of the wreckage. So what do you think? Does Kara Walker's work force people to confront stereotypes, or does it reinforce them? So, time for a very short oral essay break, if you have time. Both of these artists address African American history through fictional narrative. So, what is one similarity and one difference about how the artists address this theme? Take a couple of minutes to outline an answer, backed up with some evidence from the works or from the historical context, and then Ms. Jacobs will start pulling out her popsicle sticks. Back to the disembodied voice. Like Kara Walker, our next artist catapulted to fame at a very young age. JeanMichel Basquiat was the son of Black Caribbean immigrants who had achieved a modest middle-class lifestyle. He, in the best tradition of artists, rebelled against their efforts at upward mobility. He ran away from home, lived on the streets, and embarked on a career as a graffiti artist. In just a few years, he was rich and famous. In just a few more years, he was dead from a heroin overdose. So let's see some of his work in a short interview with the artist. I think you will appreciate his attitude toward history readings. So here's an excerpt from a blog honoring the artist on what would have been his 51st birthday. It's the raw street aesthetic that has elevated Basquiat as an early icon of hip-hop. Like the art of sampling that is present in rap music, Basquiat took separate elements and combined them to create a new, unique piece of work. Drawing from influences like Picasso's Guernica and the medical textbook Gray's Anatomy, Basquiat's technique was centered on integrating words and phrases, various objects, shapes, and symbols that set off vibrations when the seemingly unrelated elements were viewed as a whole. So, rap as art. Here you see another work by Basquiat, a photo of the artist with Andy Warhol and a photo of the artist in his studio. And here's a side-by-side comparison of horn players and a famous work by Picasso. So what similarities and differences do you see? You can certainly see the influence. Sotheby's auctioned off this painting for $110.5 million in 2017, the highest price ever paid so far at an auction for a work by an American artist. On to our final work of identity art. So what's this about? Once again, let's hear from the artist. What's decorating the chairs? What point do you think the author is trying to make? And how is it similar to and different from the sports memorabilia that John Quick-to-See Smith has put into her work Trade? The installations also included portraits of noted Black and Latino men, maybe better role models for a machismo culture. But in many ways, I think the most interesting element of this work, at least to me, is its original location. Our other artists displayed their work in big gallery shows that drew a lot of crowds, lots of crowds, frankly, of rich white people, as our Kara Walker critic notes. Asorio began his career not as an artist, but as a social worker in the South Bronx. He continues to work collaboratively with members of a local Puerto Rican or Latino community in conceiving and constructing his projects. So frequently, he shows his installations in neighborhood storefronts before he exhibits them in museums and galleries. This installation in a Puerto Rican neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut actually included a real barbershop, and barbers showed up to offer free haircuts. The artist also held workshops where residents could talk about local issues. Your reading talks about the uneasy position of Puerto Ricans within the United States. They're U.S. citizens, but do not enjoy complete political rights. And by the way, the piece is now owned by the Museum of Puerto Rican Art in Puerto Rico, but it's no longer interactive. One last comment, which I found in a news article about the opening of this work at the Hartford storefront. Quote, Carlos Lopez, a 29-year-old Washington Street resident, has tried to figure out the shop for weeks. He passed by, paused at the door, and even stopped inside to ask questions, but he still wasn't sure what to make of it. I thought it was witchcraft or something, he says. I still do. You may not have time for this, but here's an interesting short clip showing the artist installing another of his works, the scene of the crime, and talking about his dual career as a social worker and an artist. Ooh, I'm really enjoying these works, but I wish we didn't have to race through quite so fast.